I don't know how long I've been down here, but they're all watching me. They don't move when I look, but I can feel their eyes when I turn away. The worst part? I don't think I'm alone anymore. Something else is in the dark with me. I hear it, soft footsteps like bare feet on the cold concrete floor. And the mannequins, they're closer now. I didn't move them. I swear I didn't move them. I'm trying not to breathe too loudly. If I stay perfectly still, maybe they'll think I'm one of them. But I can feel my body changing, my skin hardening, my joints locking into place. This wasn't supposed to happen. I just needed a job. When I started working at the Blackwood Theater, I thought it would be easy money. Scrubbing toilets and sweeping up popcorn? No problem. I wasn't in a position to be picky. Rent was overdue, and I'd burned through my savings after losing my last job. The ad said, night janitor wanted, immediate hire, no experience necessary. Sounded perfect. The theater was about a 30-minute walk from my apartment, on the outskirts of downtown. From the outside, it looked like something out of a noir film. Ornate, crumbling, and forgotten. The marquee still had the name Blackwood Theater in big Art Deco letters, but the paint was peeling, and a few letters had gone missing. Inside, it was like stepping into the past. Red velvet curtains, tarnished gold trim, and a dusty chandelier that swayed ever so slightly, even when the air was still. The place had character, sure, but it was also falling apart. Floorboards groaned underfoot, and the flickering lights cast long, jittery shadows across the walls. It felt alive in a way that was hard to explain, like the theater itself was watching you, waiting for you to mess up. My supervisor, Greg, was a wiry guy in his 40s with a smoker's rasp and a permanent 5 o'clock shadow. He walked me through the building on my first night, pointing out the equipment and laying down the rules. Most of it was pretty standard: clean the bathrooms, mop the lobby, sweep the stage. For the first couple of nights, everything was fine. Boring even. The theater was quiet except for the hum of the air conditioning and the occasional creak of the floorboards. Then on my third shift, I heard it. I was mopping the stage when a faint melody drifted through the air. It was high and sweet, like a child humming a lullaby. I froze, my mop dripping onto the floor as I strained to listen. It seemed to be coming from somewhere above me, maybe the balcony. "Hello," I called out, my voice echoing in the empty theater. The humming stopped. I told myself it was just the acoustics. Old buildings made weird noises, right? But as the night went on, the sound came back. Faint and distant at first, then louder, closer. The next night, it wasn't humming. It was whispering. I couldn't make out the words, but it sounded like a dozen voices murmuring all at once, just on the edge of hearing. And then came the screaming. It started at exactly 2:13 a.m., echoing from somewhere deep below the stage. A long, guttural wail that made the hair on my arms stand on end. It sounded human, but not quite. I ran to Greg's office, bursting through the door like a lunatic. "Did you hear that?" I asked, panting. Greg didn't even look up from his crossword puzzle. "Hear what?" "The screaming." He smirked and waved me off. "You'll get used to it. This place has its quirks." I wanted to shake him, to make him take me seriously, but something about his nonchalance made me feel stupid, like I was overreacting. That was when I noticed the door. It was tucked away in a corner backstage, partially hidden behind an old wardrobe. Heavy and metal, with basement storage. "Do not enter" stenciled on it in faded black letters. The lock on it was massive, the kind you'd expect to see on a bank vault. But what struck me most was the smell. A faint, metallic tang, like blood and rust, wafted from the edges of the door. When I asked Greg about it, he laughed. "That's just the basement," he said. "We don't use it anymore. Too much junk down there. Besides, you don't want to go poking around in Blackwood's basement, unless you want to meet the theater's ghosts." He said it like a joke, but there was something in his tone that made me think he wasn't entirely kidding. I should have left it alone. I should have ignored the whispers and the screams and the faint pull I felt every time I passed that door. But I couldn't stop thinking about it. Every night, it felt like the door was calling to me, daring me to open it. And then one night, as I was sweeping backstage, I heard it. The lock, clicking open. On its own, the lock clicked open. It was faint, soft enough that I might have missed it if I hadn't been backstage. But I had heard it, and now the door was different. It wasn't wide open or anything dramatic like that, just slightly ajar, enough to make my breath hitch. I took a step closer, flashlight trembling in my hand. The metallic smell hit me harder than ever, sharp and acrid, like rusted iron mixed with something sickly sweet. I nudged the door gently with the end of my broom, expecting it to creak, but it didn't make a sound. The blackness beyond the door was absolute. My flashlight's beam barely cut through it, illuminating a small landing with a concrete staircase spiraling down into the abyss. I didn't go in. Not yet. Instead, I slammed the door shut and threw my weight against it like an idiot. The padlock was lying on the floor, its ancient mechanism broken in two, the metal corroded like it had been eaten from the inside out. I told myself I'd tell Greg about it in the morning, but I didn't. Somehow, I knew he wouldn't care. Or worse, that he already knew. Greg was waiting for me in the break room the next night. "You look like shit," he said, crunching into a stale vending machine sandwich. I hadn't slept much since the basement door incident. The whispers had gotten louder, almost constant now, like a faint radio station buzzing in the back of my head. I thought about quitting, but every time I picked up my phone to call Greg and tell him I was done, something stopped me. "Just tired," I muttered. Greg didn't seem to notice my nerves. He just leaned back in his chair and gave me one of his typical lazy grins. "Figured you'd survive your first week." "Barely. Yeah, this place has its quirks." He tossed the sandwich wrapper into the trash and crossed his arms. "Couple things I forgot to tell you when you started." I raised an eyebrow. "Like what?" "Rules," he said, sitting up a little straighter. "First, never touch the old props in the storage room. They're antiques, and the owners will have our heads if anything goes missing or broken." I nodded. "Sure." "Second," he continued, "don't mess with the mannequins. You'll see them around backstage, storage, sometimes even out front. They're fragile, and you don't want to be the guy who breaks one." This again. I'd noticed the mannequins here and there, propped up in the wings of the stage or tucked away in the storage room. They were dressed in tattered costumes, their paint peeling, their glassy eyes staring blankly into the distance. I didn't like being around them, but I hadn't thought much about it. "And lastly," Greg said, leaning forward, "if you hear anything weird after midnight, just ignore it. Don't go looking for it. Don't try to figure it out. Just keep your head down and do your job." The casual way he said it made my stomach churn. "What do you mean weird?" I asked, trying to sound less freaked out than I was. Greg shrugged. "You'll know it when you hear it." That night, I noticed the mannequins for the first time. Really noticed them. I was cleaning backstage when I saw it. One of them standing against the far wall. It was dressed in an old, moth-eaten gown that looked like it belonged in a Victorian melodrama. I could have sworn it hadn't been there earlier. Its face was unnerving. Most mannequins have those blank, expressionless features, but this one was too detailed. Its lips were parted ever so slightly, and its glass eyes seemed to glint in the dim light. For a second, I thought I saw a hint of moisture in its pupils, like it had been crying. I shook my head and moved it out of the way, leaning it against the far corner so I could mop. When I turned back, it was facing me. I froze, my heart pounding. It hadn't made a sound, but now its head was tilted ever so slightly, like it was curious. "Greg, if this is some kind of joke," I muttered under my breath, but the words died in my throat. I finished mopping as quickly as I could and bolted to the lobby, leaving the mannequin behind. A few nights later, I saw him. I was sweeping the stage when I caught a glimpse of movement in the upper balcony. Just a flicker of shadow, but enough to stop me in my tracks. I squinted into the darkness, trying to make out the figure. "Hey!" I called out. "Who's up there?" No answer. I grabbed my flashlight and climbed the stairs to the balcony. The whole time, I had this awful feeling like I was being lured. The air up there smelled musty, like rotting wood and old fabric. When I reached the balcony, it was empty, but the smell lingered, and my flashlight caught something strange, a handprint on the banister. It was smudged and dark, like it had been made with ash. The shadowy figure became a regular occurrence after that. I'd catch glimpses of it in my peripheral vision, a flash of movement in the wings of the stage, or a silhouette in the mirror of the dressing room. Every time I tried to follow it, I'd find nothing, just that same lingering smell of rot. The basement door wouldn't stay shut. I found it open again a few nights later, the lock still broken. This time, the door wasn't just ajar, it was wide open, and the metallic smell pouring out of it was so thick it made my eyes water. I didn't go down. I wasn't ready for that. But every time I passed it, I felt the pull, like something was waiting for me down there. And then there were the mannequins. They'd started appearing in places they didn't belong. I found one in the bathroom stall, leaning awkwardly against the toilet. Another was propped up in the lobby, facing the front doors like it was watching for something or someone. I told myself it was just Greg messing with me. He had to be. But deep down, I knew the truth. The mannequins were moving on their own, and they weren't the only ones. I don't know why I went down there. I really don't. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was the strange pull I felt every time I walked past the door, the way it seemed to hum faintly like a heartbeat. Or maybe it was just the feeling that whatever was happening in the Blackwood Theater wouldn't leave me alone until I saw what was waiting in the basement. Whatever the reason, I went. The door was open again that night, hanging wide like an unspoken invitation. The metallic smell was so strong it made my stomach churn, but I ignored it. I grabbed my flashlight, took a deep breath, and stepped inside. The stairs were steep and narrow, leading into a cavernous darkness that swallowed the beam of my flashlight. My footsteps echoed as I descended, the sound bouncing back at me like distant whispers. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The basement was massive, far bigger than I'd expected. The air was damp and cold, and the walls were lined with dusty shelves cluttered with broken furniture, cracked mirrors, and old props that hadn't seen the light of day in decades. A faint drip of water echoed somewhere in the distance, and every now and then, the flashlight beam would catch a flash of glass or metal, winking at me from the shadows. And then there were the mannequins. They were everywhere. Some were propped against the walls. Others were scattered haphazardly on the floor like discarded toys. Most of them were broken, headless, armless, their torsos cracked and splintered. But even in their disrepair, there was something unsettling about them. Their faces, or what was left of them, looked too detailed, too lifelike. The peeling paint revealed intricate lines etched into their features, like veins or scars. Their glass eyes caught the light of my flashlight and gleamed, making it look like they were watching me. I told myself it was just my imagination, but as I moved through the labyrinth of props and debris, I couldn't shake the feeling that no matter where I went, the mannequins were facing me. The whispering started again about 10 minutes in. At first, it was faint, so soft I thought it might have been the wind blowing through the vents. But the farther I went, the louder it became. Man, I froze, the flashlight trembling in my hand. The whispers weren't coming from the vents. They were coming from the mannequins. Stay with us? No, I muttered, my voice trembling. No, this isn't happening. I turned around, shining the flashlight across the room, but the mannequins hadn't moved. They were still where I'd left them, their glassy eyes staring blankly into the distance. Then one of them fell. It didn't tumble or slide. It just collapsed, landing with a hollow thud on the concrete floor. I jumped back, the sound reverberating through the basement like a gunshot. Jesus Christ, I whispered, clutching my chest. It's just gravity. The floor's uneven. That's all it is. But as I stepped closer, my flashlight illuminated the mannequin's hollow torso. Something metallic glinted inside, half buried in the splinters of its broken chest. It was a music box. I reached down and pulled it free. The thing was small and rusted, the kind you'd expect to find in an antique store. The gears were corroded, but when I twisted the key, it started playing a haunting, discordant melody that sent chills down my spine. The whispers stopped. I stared at the music box, my breath fogging in the cold air, and felt a sickening realization creep over me. The mannequins weren't just props. There was something else. The next day, I confronted Greg. "Hey," I said, slamming the music box down on his desk. "What the hell is this?" Greg looked up from his crossword puzzle, his face unreadable. "It's a music box." "No shit, isnapat." I found it inside one of the mannequins. In the basement. Greg's expression didn't change. "You shouldn't have gone down there." "Why?" I demanded. "What's down there, Greg? What's with the mannequins? And don't give me that it's just an old building crap. I know you're hiding something." He sighed and leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples like he was trying to fend off a migraine. "Look," he said, "the Blackwood Theater has a history, okay? People have been disappearing from this place for decades. Actors, stagehands, janitors, hell, even some of the audience members. But it's just old superstitions. Ghost stories." "Ghost stories?" I repeated, my voice rising. "Greg, I heard them whispering. They said my name." "That's not a superstition." Greg didn't respond. He just stared at the music box like it was some kind of curse. "If you're smart," he said finally, "you'll quit. Walk away and never come back." That night, I didn't quit. I don't know why. Maybe it was pride, or maybe it was the fact that I couldn't afford to lose another job. Either way, I showed up for my shift, determined to get through it without losing my mind. But the Mannequins had other plans. I was mopping backstage when I saw it, movement in the corner of my eye. I froze, the mop handle slick in my grip, and turned toward the source. The Mannequins were closer. They'd been scattered across the stage earlier, leaning lazily against the walls and furniture. But now they were standing upright, arranged in a semicircle around me. And one of them was smiling. It wasn't smiling before. I was sure of it. The grin was faint, just a slight curve of the lips, but it was there. I backed away slowly, my heart hammering against my ribs, but the Mannequins didn't move. They just stood there, their glassy eyes fixed on me. I told myself it was a prank. Greg must have moved them when I wasn't looking. But deep down, I knew the truth. They were moving on their own, and they weren't done with me yet. I wasn't planning to go back into the basement. After what I'd seen down there, what I'd heard, I told myself I was done. Whatever was happening in the Blackwood Theater, it wasn't my problem. I'd clean the bathrooms, mop the floors, and keep my head down until I found a better job. But the theater had other plans. I was scrubbing a particularly disgusting toilet in the men's restroom when I heard it. The sound of something heavy sliding across the floor. At first, I thought it was Greg. He had a habit of moving furniture around for no reason, usually when I wasn't looking. But when I poked my head out into the hallway, it wasn't Greg I saw. It was a mannequin. It was standing in the middle of the hall, propped up like someone had dropped it there and walked away. Its glass eyes stared blankly ahead, and its mouth, its too realistic mouth, was slightly open, as if it were about to speak. "Very funny, Greg," I muttered under my breath, but my voice wavered. I moved the mannequin to the side and went back to cleaning. 10 minutes later, it was back, standing in the exact same spot. That night, I couldn't take it anymore. I needed answers, and I knew where to find them. I grabbed my flashlight and headed into the basement, my heart pounding with every step. The smell was worse than ever, so thick and nauseating that I had to pull my shirt up over my nose just to keep from gagging. The Mannequins were waiting for me. They hadn't moved since my last visit, but they seemed closer. Their glassy eyes reflected the beam of my flashlight, making it look like they were glowing. I ignored them as best I could and started searching. If there was some kind of explanation for all this, it had to be down here. I rummaged through boxes of old props, overturned crates of crumbling costumes, and dug through piles of broken furniture. And then, tucked inside the hollow shell of a headless mannequin, I found it, a leather-bound journal, its cover cracked and worn with age. I flipped it open, and the first page nearly made me drop it. "The Art of Eternal Life," the header read, written in a spidery, looping script. Beneath it was the name Howard Blackwood. The journal belonged to the theater's founder, and as I read, my skin crawled with every word. Howard Blackwood wasn't just a showman. He was something far darker. According to his writings, he'd been obsessed with the idea of immortality, not just for himself, but for his art. He wanted to capture the soul of performance, to preserve the beauty of the stage forever. His solution was grotesque. Through a series of occult rituals, Blackwood claimed he could trap the souls of living people inside inanimate objects. He described it in detail: the chanting, the sacrifices, the intricate carvings etched into wood and plaster to hold the spirit in place. And the results? The Mannequins. They weren't props, not really. They were people, trapped souls, their bodies hollowed out and discarded, their consciousness forced to live forever inside those lifeless shells. Blackwood had started with his own actors. At first, he'd done it in secret, targeting performers who'd angered him or threatened to leave the company. But eventually, he'd grown bolder. He claimed the entire theater as his canvas, turning stagehands, janitors, and even audience members into his creations. I slammed the journal shut, my hands trembling. The mannequins weren't just creepy, they were alive. Ben, I jumped, nearly dropping the flashlight. The whispering was back, louder than ever. Stay with us. I swung the flashlight around wildly, the beam dancing across the walls and floor. The mannequins hadn't moved, but their presence felt heavier, like they were leaning toward me. No, I said out loud, backing away. No, this isn't happening. You're not real. One of them turned its head. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. Its glassy eyes locked onto mine, and its mouth opened slowly. Ben! I ran. I barged into Greg's office, still clutching the journal like it was some kind of shield. What the hell is going on here? I shouted. Greg didn't even flinch. He just sighed and rubbed his temples, like he'd been expecting this. You went back to the basement, didn't you? Of course I did. I snapped, slamming the journal onto his desk. What is this, Greg? Who the hell was Howard Blackwood? And what did he do to those people? Greg stared at the journal for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Finally, he leaned back in his chair and lit a cigarette. You don't want to know, he said. Bullshit, I spat. You knew, and you let me work here anyway. What kind of sick game are you playing? Greg exhaled a plume of smoke and looked me dead in the eye. They only take the ones who let them in, he said. What the hell does that mean? It means they're cursed, he said. The mannequins, the theater, all of it. Blackwood's rituals didn't just trap people's souls. They turned this place into a goddamn beacon. It calls to people, lures them in, and if you go looking for it, if you open the door, then you're fair game. My blood ran cold. I tried to warn you, Greg continued, his voice softer now. Told you not to mess with the mannequins. Told you not to go looking. But you didn't listen. I wanted to scream at him, to throw the journal in his face and storm out of the theater. But deep down, I knew he was right. I'd gone looking, and now they weren't going to let me go. On my next shift, I tried to avoid the basement entirely. I stayed upstairs, cleaning the lobby and mopping the stage, pretending the lower levels didn't exist. But the theater wouldn't let me ignore it. The lock on the basement door clicked open on its own, louder this time like it wanted me to hear. The metallic smell flooded the air, so strong it made my eyes water. I tried to stay away. I really did. But when I turned around, they were there. The mannequins. They were lined up on the stairs, their broken bodies arranged in a twisted procession leading down into the dark. And the one at the front, the one closest to me, had my face. The basement door was wide open again. I don't know how long I stood there, staring into the blackness. I couldn't move, couldn't think. There was nothing left in me but fear. The mannequins were still lined up on the stairs, waiting. The one with my face was front and center, its glassy eyes glinting in the dim light. I should have run. I should have walked out of the theater and never come back. But I couldn't. The pull was stronger than ever now, an invisible hand dragging me forward. My legs moved on their own, carrying me down the stairs into the cold, suffocating dark. The whispers started immediately. Ben, come back to us. Stay forever. They were louder this time, layered and overlapping, like a crowd of voices all speaking at once. I gripped the flashlight, so tightly my knuckles ached, the beam trembling as it cut through the shadows. The mannequins were everywhere, scattered across the floor and leaning against the walls. Some were missing limbs, others were headless, but all of them seemed to be facing me, watching, and then their eyes began to blink. At first, it was just one or two of them. The sound was soft, barely audible over the whispers, click, 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 as their glassy eyelids slid open and shut. But soon it spread. One by one, the mannequins came to life. Their stiff joints creaked as they tilted their heads, their faces slowly turning to follow me. I tried to tell myself it wasn't real, that it was just my imagination. But the whispers grew louder, deafening, drowning out my own thoughts. Ben, you belong to us now. The flashlight flickered, then died. No, I shouted, slamming it against my palm. But it was useless. The basement was pitch black, the only light coming from the faint glimmers in the mannequin's glass eyes. And then they moved. I felt it before I saw it. The air shifting around me, the faint scuff of something dragging across the floor. I spun around, my breath hitching as I realized they were closing in, their broken bodies staggering toward me like puppets on invisible strings. I stumbled backward, tripping over a pile of debris and falling hard onto the cold concrete. My flashlight clattered out of my hand, rolling into the darkness. "Stay away!" I screamed, but the mannequins didn't stop. Their hands were on me before I could get back up. Their touch was cold, so cold it burned. I thrashed and kicked, but their grip was impossibly strong. "Let me go!" I shouted, but my voice sounded distant, hollow, like it was coming from someone else. The whispers grew louder, reverberating inside my skull. My vision blurred as the darkness seemed to seep into my body, spreading through my veins like ice. I felt my skin hardening under their hands, the softness replaced by something smooth and unyielding. My joints locked, my muscles stiffening no matter how hard I fought to move. "No," I whispered, tears streaming down my face. "Please don't." But it was too late. The last thing I saw before my vision went completely dark was the mannequin with my face, leaning over me. Its expressionless mouth moved, forming the words I already knew were coming. "Stay with us?" And then everything went silent. It didn't take long for the theater to find a replacement. The new guy showed up about a week later, a scrawny kid barely out of high school. He looked around nervously as Greg handed him a mop and bucket, going over the usual rules with the same disinterested tone he'd used with me. "Clean the bathrooms, sweep the lobby, mop the stage," Greg said, ticking them off on his fingers. "And don't go messing around in the basement. Got it?" The kid nodded, his eyes darting toward the darkened hallway that led backstage. "Good," Greg said, clapping him on the shoulder. "You'll do fine." That night, the new janitor was mopping the stage when he heard it, the faint sound of singing drifting up from below. He paused, his brow furrowing as he looked around the empty theater. "Hello," he called out, but no one answered. The singing stopped, replaced by a faint whisper. "Come downstairs." The janitor's grip on the mop tightened as he stared toward the hallway. The basement door was open, the metallic smell wafting up to greet him. When the janitor finished his shift, he found something strange tucked under his mop bucket. It was a piece of paper, yellowed and crumpled like it had been there for years. Scrawled across it in shaky handwriting were the words, "Don't let them in. Don't go downstairs. They'll take you too." The janitor frowned, turning the note over in his hands. On the back, there was something else, a name written in the same handwriting. "Ben." He stared at it for a long moment, his stomach twisting with unease. He glanced toward the basement door, the shadows seeming to stretch farther than they should. And then he heard it, the faint sound of footsteps echoing up from the darkness below. The janitor froze, his breath catching in his throat as a shadow flickered in the corner of his eye. Slowly, he turned back toward the stage. A new mannequin was standing there. It hadn't been there before. Its face was eerily familiar, the features etched with a lifelike precision that made his skin crawl. It looked just like Ben,